great to see you all, ambassadors, development partners, distinguished panelists who will be coming to talk to us later, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media. It's great to have you here, and I'm delighted to invite you to the 13th, to the launch of the 13th edition of the Tanzania Economic Update. And today, as you can see, our report is entitled Transforming Agriculture, Realizing the Potential of Agriculture for Inclusive Growth and Poverty Reduction. Now, many of you will know that the World Bank produces economic updates in many of our member countries, including Tanzania, and here we produce them twice a year. Each edition of the Tanzania Economic Update represents the World Bank's independent assessment of what's happening in the economy and has a special topic chapter which focuses on a contemporary issue important to realizing Tanzania's development aspirations. This particular edition focuses on what it takes to support the agriculture transformation that is now happening in Tanzania and how this transformation can be leveraged into more inclusive growth with accelerated job creation and poverty reduction. A key purpose of our economic updates is to stimulate public debate. As on previous occasions, we're honored today to have a panel of eminent practitioners and thought leaders to participate in the discussion. And I would personally like to thank the panel for their presence here today. So before moving to the presentations by the World Bank team, I'd like to take a few minutes to highlight the World Bank's perspectives on the two questions that are addressed in the economic update and will be explored in detail in the presentations to follow. Firstly, what is the status and what are the key challenges facing Tanzania's medium-term prospects, economic prospects? And second, how can government crowd in more private investment in agriculture to make it a real engine for growth and poverty reduction? Firstly, let me highlight Tanzania's recent economic performance and outlook. Overall, Tanzania's macroeconomic performance remains sound. Growth is robust, inflation has remained low and stable, and exports are showing signs of a rebound. Foreign exchange reserves have declined but remain equivalent to more than 6 months' imports cover, and the shilling has remained stable. The growth of credit to the private sector has averaged near 9% during the first 9 months of 2019, up from lower than 2% in the same period last year. Tanzania is again among the top growth performers in sub-Saharan Africa, with GDP growth twice the sub-Saharan African average. However, we also know from, in particular, the Tanzania Poverty Assessment that will be launched later this week, that while growth continues to be strong in Tanzania, the poverty-reducing impacts of growth are facing some challenges. And this is why we bring in the focus on agriculture as a key element to extend inclusive growth in Tanzania, and I'll come back to that particular point. Now, part one of this economic update provides views from the macroeconomic perspective, and part two focuses on improving growth and creating jobs in agriculture, where the poor are most active. But let me start with the macroeconomic perspective. This economic update concludes that the sustainability of strong growth and job creation in Tanzania will require a larger role for the private sector and greater investment in the economy. Despite some improvement, Tanzania is still number 141 out of 190 economies worldwide in the Doing Business Index, and so still ranking behind its regional peers despite some progress, a rise in 3 points in the most recent rankings of doing business for 2020. Now, the government has committed to key reforms, such as the blueprint for regulatory reform, but progress in implementation needs to be speeded up, as is argued in the report. The business environment remains a major concern for the private sector, and this economic update underscores a number of concrete actions for government to undertake in the short term to foster more private participation in the economy, including firstly, prioritising payment of verified arrears by government agencies to private contractors and suppliers. Secondly, speeding up release of verified VAT refunds to businesses. And thirdly, ensuring that tax administration is predictable and that tax agents collect taxes from businesses fairly. And fourth, broadening the current public-private dialogue on how government policies affect businesses. Over the medium term, in order to crowd in private investment, the report highlights the need to reduce the high cost of compliance with regulations by fully executing the blueprint for regulatory reform, to avoid unnecessary government intervention in markets and improve policy predictability, and also to improve policies that attract investment in non-extractive sectors, such as agriculture and services. Additionally, it will be important to strengthen financial system oversight and regulation in order to lower non-performing loans, to boost credit to the private sector, and to preserve financial stability. Also on the overall macroeconomic situation, I wanted to emphasize a couple of points on fiscal policy, which has a critical role to play in the economy. When we look at the data, the report will argue that improving revenue collection and borrowing forecasting is important in Tanzania to strengthen budget credibility and reduce payment arrears. In this context, fiscal management in the near term will need to ensure that priority services, especially education and health, are adequately funded and that credible expenditure plans are made and met. Part 1 of the economic update points to several fiscal policy priorities in addition to those mentioned, including prioritizing public investments that deliver high returns and crowd in private investment, and implementing the recent recommendations of the joint World Bank and IMF Financial Sector Assessment Program to strengthen financial stability. In addition, intensifying the mobilization of domestic revenue through fairly taxing businesses from a broader base will be needed to finance priority recurrent and investment spending. Looking ahead, Tanzania's rich and diverse endowment of natural resources, chief among them its arable land for agriculture, will play a vital role in its development trajectory and should be managed effectively. Transforming agriculture, the subject of this economic update's part 2 or special topic, is critical to Tanzania's inclusive growth for job creation and poverty reduction. This brings me to the issue of transforming agriculture and its role in unfolding the potential for inclusive growth and poverty reduction. It seems that the rain is finding its way into the room. I don't know if you'd noticed. Agriculture, including livestock, is a central vehicle for realizing Tanzania's socio-economic development objectives. The sector is the predominant provider of livelihoods, ensures food and nutrition security, and is a driver of poverty reduction. Together with its related value chains, agriculture drives 2/3 of all jobs in Tanzania and 3/4 of jobs for the poor. Together with related processing and commerce, agriculture will and has to continue to be the mainstay of supporting more and better jobs for around 2/3 of the over 800,000 school leavers that come onto the job market every year in Tanzania. Fortunately, Tanzania stands at the beginning of an agricultural transformation that has been widely observed since 2008 and continues today. The emerging transformation offers encouraging opportunities for accelerated and increasing the reduction of poverty. What is being observed is that farmers are bringing more land into cultivation, using more labor, and practicing some form of agricultural intensification as they engage more in agricultural markets for inputs and outputs. These changes, alongside the opportunities and challenges they present, are mainly driven by the long-term increase in relative food prices after the global food crisis of 2008 and the overall rapid growth in national GDP. An integral part of this transformation process is the emergence of medium-sized farms, that is, farms that are greater than 5 hectares and smaller than 20. These farms have risen from 23% of all farmland holdings in 2008 to 35% in 2014. These farms have job-creating effects which come through their extra demand for agricultural services and other consumption linkage effects on demand for local consumption services in rural areas. The data observes that between 2008 and 2014, it's estimated that an additional 368,000 medium-sized farms emerged, creating 13 million days of additional work per annum and around 300 million in net additional annual backwards and consumer linkages. These medium-sized farms are market-oriented, they have economic links to other sectors, they invest in technology and knowledge, and attract commercial services that can provide a basis for agri-food-based tax revenue and significantly boost demand for hired labor. That means jobs. As a result, they have a significant positive spillover effect to smallholder farmers. In his presentation, my colleague Holger Krey will speak to this in greater detail. More could be done to support this trend by creating a more predictable agriculture business environment, to mobilize private investments in farming, and these encouraging trends appear to be occurring almost despite some of the current agricultural policies, more than because of them, which suggests that there is substantial potential for the government to accelerate further growth and equity in agriculture, should it wish to do so. We congratulate the government of Tanzania for recent efforts in improving the business environment for agribusiness by implementing local and national fiscal reforms, including the removal of over 100 agriculture fees and taxes and limiting the use of export bans since 2017, which is a huge step forward. Even though Tanzanian agriculture shows promising signs and more reforms are underway, progress will need to be accelerated and further scaled out to meet high national targets for overall growth, poverty reduction, and resilience to climate change. To accelerate the transformation process, over the medium term, the government should focus on, firstly, increasing the quality and pace of the implementation of necessary policy reforms to make the business environment for agriculture more profitable and more predictable. This can start with reforms outlined in the blueprint for improving the business environment to attract the much-needed private sector investments in agriculture. Secondly, increasing public investments in agricultural public goods, such as roads, in particular rural roads, water infrastructure, rural electricity, research, extension, grades and standards, all of which are necessary to drive private investment, including that of smallholders. This should be underpinned by improvements in agricultural productivity, paying attention to policies and investments that further the goals of improving the management of soils, water, and biodiversity. This is absolutely essential to sustain and optimize the natural resources on which agriculture depends, both for the present day and for the future. In the World Bank, we remain committed to supporting Tanzania's efforts for more inclusive growth and poverty reduction through agriculture as a key driver. We stand ready to support specific operations which will help the country fast-track achievement of these noble objectives. We look forward to working together with you in partnership with the private sector, development partners, civil society, and other stakeholders. And let me again thank all of you present for joining us today for the launch of this important report. Asanteni sana.
Thank you very much, Bella, for officially opening up the 13th Tanzania Economic Update. We're about to dig a little bit deeper. So we've got two great presentations from colleagues at the World Bank. So I'd like to invite Mr. Bill Battle up to the stage to share the first presentation.
Thanks very much and good morning. On behalf of the team, welcome. This morning we're going to have two presentations. I'll lead on the first one. For those who are familiar with the Tanzania Economic Update, we have two parts. The first one gives a semi-annual update on the economy, as Bella mentioned. So I'm going to go through, I think quite quickly, some of the highlights from part one, and then that'll be followed by a focus of really what the day's discussion is about, which is on transforming the agriculture sector. If we have slides. Okay, so I have very few slides. The first one gives away all the key messages in part one. We have 5 key messages. Firstly, and a lot of them Bella touched on, I'm just going to give a little bit more detail on. The first one is that Tanzania remains among the top growth performers in the region. The World Bank puts out an Africa Pulse twice a year, and in that report there's a taxonomy of established performers. Tanzania remains in that top 10 in the region, which is comparing previous GDP growth rates from 2007 to 2015 with the most recent period. So we substantiate that continued finding that Tanzania remains in that group. As Bella mentioned, real GDP growth is more than twice the sub-Saharan Africa region. So lesson from our data analysis number one. The second message relates to fiscal policy. Bella also covered some of those, so I'll just be quite brief. We see a lot of spending pressures that are accumulating on government, which are making decisions in terms of both on the public investment management side, but also on recurrent spending associated with the run-up to the elections, including the local elections that were just held and the national elections next year. And we've seen in response to that, specifically in last year's budget, a big surge in domestic borrowing, which for us is a signal of concern, especially related to any crowding out that might have with the private sector, which is already paying fairly high interest rates for any borrowing. But we do want to give the message that overall public debt remains at sustainable levels based on the debt sustainability analysis that we do jointly with the IMF. The third message in part one of this TEU relates to the business environment. There are ongoing reforms. We see the progress on those reforms going slowly. So we urge the authorities, as you'll see as you dive into the report, which is still warm in my hands, just off the press, and you'll be able to pick up a copy in the back. But these borrowing issues related to the private sector, I think, are ones that we want to bring to the fore without flagging the overall sustainability issues. Fourth issue relates to poverty reduction. Bella mentioned importantly, and I don't want to preempt the launch of the poverty assessment that's coming out on Friday. So a lot more detail, a lot more analysis there. We just have a few of the headlines, which I'll have on a slide coming up shortly. Basically, the poverty reduction rate continues to fall, but at a decreasing rate from what we've seen between the 2007 and 2012 household budget surveys. With the high population growth rates, the implication is an increase in the total number of poor between 2014 and 2017-18. And then lastly, in terms of the headlines, we have an outlook that remains positive on growth for Tanzania, but we do raise two concerns on sustainability and also inclusiveness. And we've had the last two Tanzania economic updates have been on the HD side, on human capital development, which is extremely important. We very much welcome the focus of this Tanzania economic update specifically on the issues of sustainability and inclusiveness of growth, with broad private investment being a key issue that we put an emphasis on, and we see agriculture as being a very nice response in terms of that concern. So I have a slide each on those 5 messages, but you already have the headlines. So coming back to the growth message, we have a number of pictures here that are featured in the report, specifically related to some of the underlying drivers of growth. So on the top left out of these 3 pictures, we have data that's substantiating from the Bank of Tanzania, and this is all official data that we base our analysis on, but substantiating the pickup in exports. So exports have been, for the last 2 years, quite a concern. As you can see, in the 12 months ending in September 2017, quite a contraction in overall exports. A lot of this was concentrated in manufacturing exports. We saw in the 12 months ending in September 2018, roughly flat performance. And this has since picked up, mostly driven by a pickup in mining, specifically gold, and also in manufacturing exports. So we see this as quite a positive sign on growth. The top right panel shows the latest data on private sector credit growth. Again, something that has been quite flagging, not only in Tanzania, but in East Africa in general. But we see that trend reversing, close to 9%, over 9% for the 12 months ending in September in private sector credit growth. On the bottom panel, we have the latest NBS data. So the second quarter of GDP combined with the first quarter, we are showing a half year here. Again, this is the official NBS data. Growth has been maintained at a high level according to official sources at 6.9% for the half year. Our own independent assessment also confirms a notch up in the growth performance from 2018 to 2019. So this is all fairly good news on the macro front. I would put in one caveat in terms of the financial sector issues, and Bella mentioned these. I think the high level of NPLs for us is an issue to continue to watch. And I think as you look into the report, you'll get a little bit more of the information on that. So turning to the second message on fiscal policy, we've got 4 charts here from the report. The top left will give you a sense in terms of the revenue, domestic revenue collection in Tanzania. And you see consistently between what's budgeted and the outturn, there has been a growing gap coming up to the last full fiscal year that was in 18-19 of underperformance. And when we give this headline in terms of spending pressures, of course, this is all relative to the resource envelope that the government has to work with. So we see this as constraining implementation of fiscal policy as envisioned in the budget. You can see in the right most column of the upper left panel, if you can follow me, this white bar shows the next year's budget. What we're currently in, it's not an outturn, it's a plan, but it's above 17% of GDP. So for us, this is a signal that it may be quite challenging for government to actually meet its mark of a 2.3% deficit. The other charts that you have here speak to, top right, the spending pressures that I mentioned. Again, if you look at the far right budget number for what is expected in terms of goods and services expenditure, we've seen notching up over the years in terms of the amount of expenditure that's necessary for debt servicing, and then also increase on the wages side. So we're showing in terms of what's budgeted, which is covering the first half of the fiscal year, is what we're experiencing right now. Second half of the fiscal year will be run up to the national elections. So we see this as a particular concern that we're flagging. The bottom left gives you a sense in terms of how the fiscal deficit was financed last fiscal year, with a large increase in terms of the amount of domestic borrowing government has been doing. 2.3% of GDP, which is quite an increase, which is the bottom left panel and the part of the bars that's flagged in orange. As I mentioned at the opening slide, in terms of concerns about crowding out for private sector, pressures that this has on the domestic financial markets, we see this as a serious issue going forward. And it also speaks to the realism of borrowing plans that are necessary for fiscal policy to deliver its intended goals. And then finally, on fiscal policy, the bottom right panel here shows it's the overall fiscal deficit, but of course this is an underestimation if you're also considering, which you should, the payment arrears that government is incurring. So the data on this we find to be a bit challenging to get. So we are flagging that even though the 3.2% was the highest fiscal deficit under this current fifth phase administration, it's an underestimation of up to 2 to 3% percentage points of GDP on the actual fiscal deficit. So that's concluding on the fiscal messages. Just turning quickly to the remaining three messages. Business environment, Bella already mentioned our doing business that comes out from the World Bank. The 2020 report came out, always comes out on Halloween. The news for Tanzania was actually not too scary. They actually improved three slots on the ranking. But what we're showing here is actually relative to other regional comparators, and especially those with a lower per capita GDP. Tanzania is actually faring not so well. It's a little bit small. I don't know if you can appreciate from, especially in the back of the room, but basically we have on the left-hand side panel, it's from 2015 doing business, and the right-hand panel is from the latest 2020 doing business. And we have in here basically an outperformance of any country that is lower horizontally from Tanzania is a lower income level, and it's being surpassed by a number of countries. And this has actually been quite stagnant over time. So I think, as we mentioned in Bella's comments in my opening slide, the reform agenda is there by government, and we applaud government for embarking on the blueprint for regulatory streamlining, et cetera. But in terms of the implementation, which is what the Doing Business Index counts, it counts actual reforms, not just on the rhetoric. So we see a big urgency there going forward. Specific areas that are flagged into doing business are at the bottom of this slide, which include trading behind borders, paying taxes, registering property, and we invite you to get, if you're interested in the details on doing business, there's a whole assessment there on Tanzania. And if I've lost my slides, okay, we still have 2 slides to go. One on poverty reduction. As I mentioned, the headlines, we're only capturing really a sliver of the deeper analysis that is coming out on Friday on the poverty assessment, with the headline being that the number of poor has increased. That's the left-hand side panel, even though the poverty rate has decreased from 28 to 26%. And then on the right-hand side, in terms of the result that Bella mentioned in terms of the poverty impact of growth, or what is technically called the growth elasticity of poverty, that is now estimated using the latest household budget survey as considerably lower than it was for the period 2007 to 2012. So the impact on poverty reduction from growth is declining, and this is where it links in very well, I think, with the part 2 of this report in terms of how can we actually get more impact for growth that Tanzania is enjoying. So Tanzania is a top growth performer, but the poverty impact is declining based on the latest data from the household budget survey. My last slide is the forward look that you'll find in part 1. Here, as I mentioned, the growth outlook remains positive. We see growth over the medium term of around 6%. That's a real GDP growth rate. We have assumptions on that forward look, which include modest but steady continuation of reforms of improving the business environment and also on fiscal management. Bella mentioned a few of those issues, specifically on fiscal management, which relate to speeding up on the VAT refunds, also covering or reducing significantly the stock of outstanding payment arrears that government has with the private sector. In terms of the poverty outlook over the medium term, we see a modest decline in the poverty rate, so still coming down from 26, with the number of poor remaining stable as we get to about 2021. But again, I invite you all to get more details on the poverty story from our much deeper analysis in the poverty assessment coming up later this week. And then in terms of downside risks for this outlook. So the 6% is subject to some downside risks, which are mentioned on the slide. If the reform agenda on business environment and on fiscal management slows even more, this can bring the growth rate down below where we see it at about 6%. Also in terms of the financial sector, these vulnerabilities that exist in terms of the high level of NPLs, for example, if those get exacerbated, this is also a downside risk. And then, as most will know, in terms of the overall external environment, and this is not just on Tanzania, this is across the region, and this is globally, in terms of trade uncertainty, which has been well broadcast in the global media. This is something that can also bring the growth outlook down below 6%. Although the good news for Tanzania, so far it's actually weathered pretty well. When I showed you the export rebound, this is in spite of the declining global environment. And I think part of that has to do with a key export being gold, which can do well when there are times of uncertainty. But I do want to underscore that in addition to these downside risks, there's an upside potential as well. So in terms of where we could go from 6% and reaching a potential above that towards 7%, we do want to encourage the authorities, if the reforms are speeded up faster than what we're assuming in our baseline, we can get above 6% on the growth side. Then the last point, which is a segue for Holger's presentation, in terms of accelerating poverty reduction and accelerating job creation, an underscored message in the part one is about the additional scope for the private sector that we'd like to see in the economy. The fundamentals for sustainability and growth really center around this pillar. There's been a lot of government, public sector-driven growth, especially around government development projects. That's also on the job side as well. So in terms of additional growth, sustaining high growth, and adding more jobs, we see the potential from the transformation going on in the agriculture sector as a fantastic opportunity to strike on both sides of both making growth more robust and sustainable, and also increasing the poverty reduction impact from that growth. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. Let me turn over now to Holger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps this big poster here should not be labeled transforming agriculture, but agriculture transforming. And that is the case I'm going to make in my presentation. My name is Holger Krey. Good morning. Very happy to speak in front of you. I'm the practice manager for agriculture and food at the World Bank. And I have the pleasure of presenting a chapter that in actuality has been prepared by a team led by Emma Isinika Modamba here with us in the room, together with many of you in the room. Allow me, before I go into the actual economic update, a little preface, a little background thinking on agriculture and why what we're going to present is entirely a good news story. This will be very different from many presentations you've been hearing about agriculture, which are usually on small farms, flat yields, not much happening. This is fundamentally different, and this is why it is agriculture transforming. And this matters quite a bit because of the fundamental role that overall economic growth and employment has in interrelation with the agriculture sector. The report argues, as you will see once it's being handed out following my presentation, it argues that agriculture matters in so many interactions with macro. First, it is because of the changing consumer behavior in the cities of Tanzania, but also in the cities of the continent, a completely different demand for a completely different output of agriculture, not any longer just a raw, non-processed product, but an increasing appreciation on value addition and a demand for it. So that's not just a policy vision, there is actually market demand. The second is that this spills over into income in the rural space, income on farms, income of those that are active in the agriculture sector. And the third is the relationship between agriculture and so many processing industries through raw materials. So let me not go too deep into that. But the key point is that we feel that all it takes to basically push the transformation that started about 5-6 years ago is at least reflected in the strategic underpinning that Tanzania has developed for herself. And see, I show on this slide the original graph of the content of the Tanzania Agriculture Sector Development Plan number 2. And from the first moment on that I saw it and that I started reading ASTP 2, I felt like this is a really very appropriate, sufficiently modern agriculture strategy for that type of agricultural development we are observing in Tanzania and that I will be talking about in a moment. So let me briefly explain why I think this is particularly modern and particularly appropriate. Look at that visual representation, which in the middle, let me start with pillar 2, not with pillar 1, in the middle of everything stands, of course, production and productivity. And see, this is sort of fairly common for an agriculture sector development vision. It is very appropriate since that is an objective, but it is, excuse my French, it's plain vanilla. Many agriculture sector development strategies rest on that only pillar, but not so ASTP 2. ASTP 2 brackets productivity in two very essential other pillars. One is the commercialization pillar, and I'll be talking about it in a moment, how particularly a focus on adding value to primary agriculture production is what starts driving an agricultural engine. It's not only there in the sector, it's explicitly reflected in national strategy and will hopefully also find even more reflection in future in the support that government provides through public goods, through investments to the agri-food sector. But look at the other pillar. So finally we are arriving at pillar 1, the left-hand pillar from your side. It is explicitly a pillar on the natural resource basis. It is a pillar on soils, it is a pillar on water, it is a pillar on resilience, which is also something I plan on talking about in a moment. For a net exporter like Tanzania, an agriculture net exporter, Tanzania is not only a net exporter of agriculture products, Tanzania therewith is also a net exporter of water. Water that's being produced consumed in the production of these agriculture goods. So Tanzania is a net exporter of virtual water. So considering water constraints in a global environment where we see a concerning acceleration of climate change with quite a change in rainfall patterns is very appropriate. Considering the health of soil and biodiversity as the foundation of agriculture production is very appropriate. So now I've made my case why I consider pillar 2, 3, and 1 particularly appropriate. But it doesn't end with that. All this rests in this visualization on a base slab of better regulation and better policy. And I think if I had to stop my presentation here, which I will not, I would actually say this is a roadmap, this is a pathway, and it has all the elements that in principle need to be put in place and emphasized for agricultural transformation to actually speed up even more than it already does, and this is what my next points will be about. As Bella has been alluding to, our report that you will be receiving in a moment indeed makes the case that Tanzania already witnesses the onset of a very profound agriculture transformation. It's beyond embryonic, it's measurable, it's significant, and it starts dominating the agriculture economy in many regions. The sector grows in size, it grows in real value of agriculture, mainly due at this point in time due to area expansion, but there is significant growth that we observe at this point in time. What I find most noteworthy, see, growth can happen due to many reasons, but if we look into the data that underpins it, the activity of markets, we actually observe significant market activation, acceleration in markets for agriculture factors, so that's land and labor, inputs, in output here from within that relevant chapter in the report. The number of farms hiring labor, so farms as employers, hiring labor for more than 1 day as a measurable criterion, has increased to 50% of the farming population. So here goes your myth on farms not really being a source of employment. Farms that only use family labor force, nothing wrong with that, at least for the farmers in the room that stood up earlier, I was one of them, but the share of farms that exclusively use labor force is dropping significantly. It's down to 24% from 33 at the reference period, and that is a significant structural change, or to use that vocabulary, a transformation, the onset of a transformation. Land, the share of farms leasing in land, so actually seeing an economic rationale to pay to get land from their neighbors into their holdings, increases 12 to 16%. Also that, I mean, see the multiplier in this. And then marketing. Farms that market their output through formalized channels, up from 36 to 41%, quite an activity in the market, and I could continue to spell out numbers for you. We have been measuring, for instance, the relative distance between farmers and service provision. What does Holger mean with this? So how far is it actually for a farmer to gain access to telecom services, insurance services, banking services, mechanization services, and so on and so forth? These distances are reducing, both in time, but also in geographic distance. Frequency of buyer interactions increasing. So this is indeed a good news story on the onset of, it's not just a blip, it's not just one indicator that trends upwards. We see a systemic change in the sector. Labor productivity increases. But it doesn't increase yet at a desirable rate. Right now at around 1%, this is mainly due to the expansion of land, and in some farming segments also due to the reduction of labor input per unit, so per hectare. But see, if we stay on a general level, which I'm doing right now, we will not really get to the bottom of this, so I'll invite you in a moment to think with me by farm size groupings, to understand a little better where do we actually observe this dynamism, and what of this dynamism is a very desirable source of future development in the rural space. And then labor mobility, from lower to higher productivity agriculture, and also rural to urban. This is part of the labor force migration and labor force mobility that accompanies transformation in agriculture, and I'm happy to talk about whether these jobs leave agri-food or whether they stay within agri-food. Spoiler alert, they stay mostly within agri-food. They just largely move to different and better occupations. So I said we need to look at this by farm size clusters, and I frankly acknowledge, and this is sort of a disclaimer at the very beginning, that farm size is a pretty bad criteria. Those of us that have a little basic understanding of agriculture have seen relatively small farms that generated big income. I met one farmer just outside of Dar es Salaam. She makes quite an income on a little more than 1 hectare because she's in the horticulture industry, she caters to hotels. I have met very large farmers who are exclusively in the grain industry and who barely make a family income. So much as a disclaimer, I do not think that farm size is a sufficient criterion for this discussion, but as a crutch, as a proxy, let's use it for the next two, three minutes. What I want you to take out of the next 2-3 minutes is that there is a certain bracket of farmers in Tanzania that are really different from anything we've been seeing, like, say, 10 years ago and before. It's farmers that employ, it's farmers that invest into capital goods, it's farmers that attract service provision, it's farmers that have positive spillover effects on poverty, and it's a farm segment that, and that's usually where farmers start booing and ministers of finance start applauding. It's a farming segment that generates tax income for a country. So what is it I'm talking about? The headline of this slide says the growth of medium-scale farm segment has strong spillovers. I'll come to that in a moment, but let me not exclusively focus on medium-sized farmers. Bella introduced that concept in her speech. She said these are farms between 5 and 20 hectares. But I always felt like, as excited as we are about that slight growth in farm size, there's more to it. So we wanted, for purposes of the work that we're putting in front of you, to also break down a little better the smallholder economy, because it really matters. And so before we actually go into the numbers on this graph, I invite you to look with me into the clusters here. I'm trying to show this with my pointer here on the left-hand panel. I apologize to all of you that can't see the left-hand panel. See, we looked into smallholder farmers and subdivided them into 4 groups. The 2 left ones are smallholder farmers with a so-called on-farm focus. The next 2 are smallholder farmers with an off-farm focus. So let me explain that. It's basically the simple question of what is their main income attention devoted to? Do they generate most of the majority of their income from their farming activity, or are they a smallholder farmer who in principle has more of a focus on other gainful employment but not from their farm? The farm is basically the homestead, the residence, and a little agricultural activity. So the left 2 corners are groupings are farmers with an on-farm focus. They generate most of the income on their farm, and they have an ambition related to their farm. The right-hand side are the small farms with an off-farm focus, so their main attention is on non-farming activities. Now within the left-hand 2, and sorry, we need to go into this detail, but it comes together in a moment. Again, we have made a separation. We have those that say not com and com. Not com are the ones who are not yet really like commercialized, who don't sell more than 50% of their outputs to a commercialized market. The ones that are commercialized are already like connected to markets and show a dynamism in local markets. And this might sound like an extremely complex division of the smallholder economy, but it offers tremendous insights that are quite often completely hidden and forgotten when we discuss the smallholder as if she was or he was just a homogeneous group of rural dwellers. They are not. See, first, let's look at the dynamics. What the green bars you see here is the share of these farm groupings in arable land in Tanzania. Message number 1. Over the recent couple of years, particularly the medium-sized segment has been growing significantly and now accounts for almost 40% of the agricultural land. Remember my initial statement. Farmers that employ, invest, attract service provision, have poverty spillover effects. This is not just like a minuscule random side phenomenon. It is already becoming like almost a majority of agricultural land. And even within the smallholders, we see that those that are on-farm focused, on more commercialized, are actually increasing their economic outcomes. And so I will now be replacing the green bars with blue bars. Sorry. That didn't work. This is strange. Are we having the PDF loaded or the PowerPoint? Yeah, I would like to have the PowerPoint. Bear with me for a moment, because this is one of the very, very essential effects in this presentation. Perhaps let's not wait for this, but I'll come back to that in a moment. The point of the change in the bars is basically that there are these 2-3 clusters for which we really see an increase also in economic outcomes. So everything I allege on the positive outcomes, employment, but also tax revenue, and so shows particularly for the medium-sized farmers and for the smallholder farmers with a commercialization focus. So for everything that I say now in the rest of that presentation in terms of activity, I am not saying let's focus exclusively on a medium-sized farmer segment. What I'm saying is there is a bracket among the small ones and among the medium ones that really make a difference to the rural economy. I do not want to antagonize against large farms. Nothing against large farms, very important, very productive. But what sets medium and small apart, that it is a home brew, a homegrown phenomenon. It's Tanzanians that invest into Tanzanian agriculture, quite often in the medium segment based on initial urban non-agricultural income, but it is a homegrown phenomenon. So let me continue while the colleagues say that again. Okay, I apologize to colleagues attending this event through the web stream. We're replacing or changing the presentation that's being shown. It's just a question of PDF versus PowerPoint format. Where I want to go with you from this, so here's the excitement about a structural change actually happening. But why is this so exciting? One of the core questions that Bella raised is employment generation, also in the rural space. And remember that number that Bella quoted? I find this is a stunning number, that just by, is this the PowerPoint now? Thank you very much. See, this is this transition that I promised, right? From the green bars to the blue bars, and it might be looking like halfway insignificant to you, but pay attention to the left-hand side columns and the medium sizers, so that big column, right? So they increase not only in terms of the hectares under cultivation, but particularly in terms of economic outcomes. Even smallholders here increase their economic outcome, the value addition on the farm, and this is a support-worthy phenomenon. So any narrative that's basically saying smallholder agriculture is not getting there, smallholder agriculture is getting there, it might need a couple of additional services, which I will explain in a moment. Thank you, colleagues, for bringing on this, because this is a very important distinction. So agriculture transformation is affecting jobs on and off farm. Remember the number that Bella mentioned as part of her presentation? I find this is a truly stunning number. 13 million additional days of hired wage annually created by that farming segment. 13 million wage labor days annually. This is a very, very significant source of labor income in the rural space. And remember how I had said they have positive spillover effects on poverty. How does that work? How positive spillover effects on poverty? Among others, through the labor market. I have been meeting medium and smallholder farmers in this setting who told me the following story. For a smallholder to cultivate 1 hectare of land with a hoe takes roundabout, say, 30 days. What we see happening quite often is that the medium scaler visits his neighbor, the smallholder, and says, see, let me till your field with my tractor. I can do that within 1 day. And then the 29 days that you have saved, I will buy into my farm, because I need labor force, you need cash income. And thereby, it's almost a symbiotic relationship that emerges between that more dynamic segment and the smallholders, the non-commercialized smallholders. So for the first time, there's wage income in the rural area. And it's almost as if this farm segment sets in motion a tremendous process. So 13 million additional days of hired work, 350 billion Tanzanian shilling additional demand for farm inputs and services. These are tremendous numbers. And so if you ask yourself, and that's quite often a core question. See, let me start differently. If you meet an economist, nothing against economists, I'm one myself, who tells you that as a country develops, agriculture, agri-food becomes less important, don't believe him. Because in actuality, in so many developed, industrialized nations, agri-food is the most important, the second most important, or the third most important sector, if we just consider it agri-food. And remember how the objective number 3 of ASDP is agricultural commercialization. right? And that is exactly the engine that sets it all in motion. These jobs that quite often are released from farm are actually added in the downstream sectors, in agro-processing and in agri-commerce. And then again, quite often it's almost a shortcut thinking that we say, oh, we need larger industrialized processing units to generate jobs. It's not actually there where big amounts of jobs are being created. Significant amounts, shares of jobs are created in the accessory sectors surrounding agriculture. Those businesses that sell to farms, that buy from farms, that service farms in terms of repair, in terms of insurance, in terms of banking. Look at these numbers here, and intentionally I showed you that strange Excel table here because it has this nice comparison between countries. In Tanzania, 2.5% of the jobs are in agro-processing, but 15.6% are in related commercial services. And you see this trend is being mirrored in other countries in the neighborhood. Interesting relationship between, say, the Rwanda numbers, the Zambia numbers, and the Tanzania numbers. The more diversified an agricultural economy, the less it is just based on basic staple grains, the more space there is obviously for job creation in the agricultural economy. Towards the end of my presentation, I want to discuss 3 action areas for you. I said this is a good news story only. And even the recommendations are a good news story because, see, they are not only identified and therewith addressable, they are also already all foreseen in ASDP 2. So in principle, the strategic foundation is there already. Remember how Bill told you about the Doing Business 2020 assessment and how Tanzania is doing? What I'm showing you here is basically the agricultural equivalent to it, or the agriculture, agri-food attachment to it. Sorry. It's called EBA, Enabling the Business of Agriculture. It's also available online, eba.worldbank.org. It renders very nicely even on cell phones. And it assesses how costly is it to do business in agriculture and in associated agribusiness. And so the message for Tanzania coming out of it is that, in principle, Tanzania is doing moderately satisfactory. It's definitely doing better than the regional average. The green bars are the regional average. But it has 2 very pronounced pockets of reform needs. One in the area of fertilizer registration and marketing, and one in the area of trade and agri-food products. And why does this matter, that we have 2 pockets of reform need when everything else is actually doing well? Have you heard of Liebig's barrel? That's very agricultural right now, right? But it has its application also to this. Or Liebig's law of the minimum. Let's all imagine a barrel, a wooden barrel in front of us, and then the individual boards, they call it the staves. I looked this up in a dictionary last night, right? So the individual boards are all almost of equal height, just one is much shorter. So now we want to fill that barrel with water. How high can we fill it? We can only fill it as high as the lowest of these boards, of these staves, is in a barrel. That's Liebig's principle about, like, if there's one limiting factor, you can basically have all the others optimum, but there's one that's limiting and the sector will not do better than that, or the soil will not do better than that. And that's this principle. Unfortunately, a lot of progress, particularly in the crop-based economy, is being held back by reform needs in these areas. The report details that in greater detail. This fits beautifully, Bill, into your positive assessment of the vision behind the blueprint, but also into your narrative around the need for action in selected areas. Activity need number 2. Or constraint to be addressed, number 2, better soil and water management. See, this is to be expected when an agriculturalist stands in front of you, an agricultural economist, but this is really of great concern. A lot of the question on how resilient the rural economy is depends on water, soil, and biodiversity. Let's not forget, agriculture production is a biological, geological activity. Right? And if agriculture experiences particular dips, then macroeconomy also experiences particular dips. And unfortunately, what we are seeing now from year to year is a much more accelerated progression of climate change, and thus much more irregular rainfalls, much more regular weather patterns. And see, the best way to hedge against this is to work on soil fertility. Healthier soils have better resilience for the plant. Better water management helps with resilience. What is resilience, by the way? Resilience is the ability to recover after the impact of a shock. And whereas Eastern Africa used to be hit every about 10 years by extreme weather events, it's now every 2.5 years, and there's no prediction that it says we'll see a relaxation of this situation. So better management of soil, of water, and of biodiversity will not only help on the farm, but I mean, let's think through if the ambition is commercialization. And commercialization and processing are water-intense activities in food and feed products. Water might very soon become the bottleneck of ASDP2 type development in Tanzania. And this is not a doom and gloom scenario, but see, as somebody who works across countries in the sub-region, if there's something that really keeps me awake at night, then it is exactly the question, can we please, as regional, as national, as regional, or as global citizens, think through how agricultural policy and natural resource policy in countries can incentivize more soil, water, and biodiversity-friendly policy. The COP25 is ongoing in Madrid. If you hear the messages coming out of there, I think you're as concerned as I am. And that's why I close with my last slide, a more thoughtful public spending on agriculture and rural development. Sorry, I had to use that acronym, ARD. Didn't fit this slide otherwise. More thoughtful spending on agriculture and rural development to boost productivity. A couple of messages on that. The key message, see, when I think about spending, I think in terms of quantity, is it enough? And in terms of quality, is it good enough? Unfortunately, I would like to discuss with you on both dimensions. First on the quantity, we allege that spending right now is below any reasonable targets. It's below the CAADP commitment that Tanzania has concluded as part of the African Union Compact on the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, significantly below that. It is lower than most of your neighbors, which from a competitive position might not be a rational position. And then this relatively low spending also to a lower than needed degree focuses on the provision of public goods. I would allege in closing that if we think through how improved spending could look like, we have to ask ourselves two questions. First, what would it be that this state, a country, would ideally invest on? And the second is, who would it be in terms of the beneficiaries? So let me make that distinction carefully. What is needed given that agriculture transformation pattern that I outlined? And everything except the climate story was a good news story, remember. It appears that on two particular fronts, a public service and a public good and public investment is needed. One is on helping with value addition. Value addition and investment into enhancing the addition of value on farm and off farm does usually not emerge just out of the blue. It's very capital intensive, and it's quite often more capital intensive than the entrepreneurs can afford during the infant industry period. So there is a rationale, at least for a partial support mechanism, either through creating investment liquidity or through partial grant mechanisms. This is country by country a different case, but there is a rationale for doing this, an economic rationale. And remember my story on how this generates better tax income and creates fiscal savings. That also serves to refinance these investments. So it's a rational strategy to invest into value addition on farm and off farm. And the second is resilience. Increasingly, we need to think through whether the way we support agriculture actually leaves a sufficiently good footprint on the environmental footprint of agriculture. This is not to say spend less on agriculture, it's to spend differently. Instead of, and I take an example completely out of the blue, instead of providing just fertilizer and seed to farmers, can we think about awarding support, particularly to farmers, if they embark on productive diversification away from monoculture that depletes soils in the way that I described. There's a whole initiative going on that's called a coalition on the repurposing of agriculture spending, and I invite you to discuss this with us. So those are the questions: what to support, value addition and resilience, very clear. But whom to support? That is a key question in structuring future support. And you have seen the positive spillover effects of these market-oriented smallholders and the medium-sized farmers. I would allege that these must be a particular focus of public policy, and mainly through support in the area of productive infrastructure, access to electricity, access to roads, access to logistics centers, access to joint packaging, grading, marketing facilities can make a world of a difference to these farmers. The small and medium-sized farmers that are like market-oriented that I visited all don't need support with a little seed or a little fertilizer. What they really need is access to more to the market and that market facilitation. And then there's, of course, the smallest of the smallholders, those that are particularly vulnerable, that are particularly non-resilient at this point in time, might need specific incentives and knowledge to up their ability to stay resilient even in the face of a changing climate. So let me close here. I thank you for your interest in this particular topic. And again, if I want you to take two things out of my presentation, take them back home. First, this is entirely a good news story. We see a profound agriculture transformation at this point in time. It just takes a little accompanying with the right public policy measures. And the second is what makes this transformation so specific is that we see a whole generation of farmers that employ, that invest, that attract service provision, that have spillover effects on poverty. I thank you for your interest.
Okay, thank you very much, Holger, for your insightful presentation. We're going to call up the panelists to the front. It's time for us to get discussing, and it will just allow people, 2 or 3 minutes to stand up, stretch their legs as we get you mic'd up. So if I could call up our panelists, Professor Nyange, please, if you could come to the stage, Dr. Blandina Kilama from Rapport. We've got Jafet Justine from Tanzania Agricultural Development Bank. Holger, you're already on stage. And we also have Mr. Franklin Bagala from CEO Tomoni Farms. If you could come up, and technical team, if you can support us just to get the radio mics on. Everybody else, can we stand up and just have a quick stretch? We need just 5 minutes to get the mics ready. Okay, so this morning we've heard two very insightful presentations from colleagues at the bank. And we are now at the second, or have reached the second part of the Tanzania Economic Update, where we hear from our esteemed panelists here. So I'll just introduce them briefly, and then we will kick off with our rounds of questions, and there will be an opportunity, of course, for the audience to interact with the panelists. So on the far left here, we have Professor David Nyange. He's from the Ministry of Agriculture, Policy Advisor there. We have Mr. Franklin Bagala, who is the CEO of Tomoni Farms. So he will be giving his insights here. I believe, Holger, you've heard from extensively the practice manager who's come from Washington, D.C., from the Global Practice for Agriculture and Food. To my right, we've got here the CEO of Tanzania Agriculture Development Bank, Mr. Jafet Justine. And last but definitely not least, my fellow female panelist here, Dr. Blandina Kilama, who is representing Rapport, and will provide some insights there from a research perspective. So I will kick off with Professor Nyange, if I may, and we are very curious to hear from you. In your views, what do you think have been the main drivers of this emerging agricultural transformation? We're on this journey towards being a middle-income country in 2025. And so I'm curious to know how we can catalyze this even more. So some of the drivers and how we can further catalyze.
Yeah, I think a number of factors have contributed to the emergence of these medium-sized farms. Number one is the rise in global food prices, which Tanzania is part of it since the 2008, the global food price crisis. food prices have stayed high and have become an incentive for increased investment in agriculture, particularly in the agri-food systems. Another factor is the overall economic performance in Tanzania and in the region. For over 15 years, Africa has experienced rapid economic growth, and that has given rise into, I would say, middle class, and fueled the demand for food. And that has become a really an incentive for increased investment in agriculture. And from the supply side, I think technology has played quite a big role. As you might have seen in the report, there has been an increased use of farm technology, from increased use of fertilizer, increased use of improved seeds, but also increased use of farm machinery. Over years, the cost of technology has been decreasing and hence become affordable, especially to these medium-sized farms. But most importantly, we see some of the farm technologies being unpacked into smaller packages that are affordable. For example, the traditional tractor used to be about 100 horsepower. Nowadays, you can see up to 45, 25 horsepower tractors. The small hand-driven tractors, the power tillers, which are very popular in Tanzania, are very good examples. But we also see even the combines are being unpacked into mini combines. For example, recently I visited one farm in Morogoro, and I was surprised to find over 12 mini combined farms harvesting rice in an irrigation scheme.
Thank you very much, Professor. We will come back to you in a moment, but I would like to move to Dr. Kilama. I want you to tell us a little bit more from your perspective about how economic transformation takes place in our country, in particular in Tanzania, and what role you see agriculture potentially playing in our transformation.
Thank you so much, Miranda. It's great to be here. Now, I really appreciate the presentation that was made by Cray and some of the initial work that we had undertaken. When you think about economic transformation, in most cases you look at it in 4 ways. Okay, so the first bit will be you want to see the share of agriculture dropping in general GDP. But then at the same time, you would want to see people moving from, migrating from the rural areas to urban areas. But then at the same time, the third bit, you want to see actually people who are engaged in industry and services rising. And the last bit is the demographic transition. And in particular here, you'd want to see both birth and death falling. Now maybe just let me expound a little bit. From Professor Nyange, what he has just said is, it's one thing when you're looking at the economic transformation at the macro level, but it's something else once you start going to these different areas. There are different initiatives that are ongoing that would allow you to say, you know what, this place is actually really changing, or if we're still lagging behind, there are other areas that we have to think about. And in particular, at the end of the day, it's simply going to be you want to see rise in productivity. And your productivity is either going to come from capital or is going to come from labor. And for a country like Tanzania, where do we want to see most of the productivity rising? We want to see it in labor, because only when it's coming from labor, then you will say, you know what, the transformation we are seeing is actually generating a lot of employment. So at the end of the day, you would not want to see any transformation coming from capital at the same time shedding your labor out. If that's the transformation you have, then you say like, there is something that needs to need to be fixed. But then on the other hand, even when this transformation is happening, what you want to say, I like what Bella said when she was giving her opening remarks, you want to take on board people who are joining the market now, meaning the youth needs to be taken on board. But importantly for me as a woman, I'll say you also want to see this transformation taking on board women also. So I think I'll start with that for now.
Thank you. Let's talk about lending to the agricultural sector, and of course we've got our CEO of Tanzania Agricultural Development Bank. So Japhet, I'm interested to know whether you think commercial lending is sufficient for agricultural transformation, and what needs to change, or how can we further unlock agricultural lending?
All right. Thank you so much. It's quite a good event, and I'm happy with what my colleague from World Bank said is agriculture transforming, and vice versa of transforming agriculture, looking at agriculture and looking at the role of the banks in Tanzania, and especially commercial lending. We still see there is a lot of opportunities for the banks to play a critical role in this transformation, and for it to happen, I think we look back at what we're doing currently. If you look at the banking sector today, we have asset worth of 16 trillion in terms of loans. That's the average number. But hardly 1 trillion is what goes to agriculture, which is literally you're talking about to every 100 loans which were approved yesterday, only 9 are agriculture-based. So that's it's quite a reminder that there is a constraint, and that needs to happen, especially on resource mobilization. But I think key to take note, especially on the structure of the banking sector, you realize that the big 2 banks, I call them big boys, the CRDB, NMB, they're counting around 40% of the market share. And then you've got a bigger chunk of banks, some are coming from foreign entities, and clearly for them agriculture is a no-go zone area. And you feel you can't transform with only the 2 entities, the big boys, but essentially we are happier when the government intervened through the SDP2 and SDP1, then came SDP2, where the government started the Tanzania Agricultural Development Bank, typically DFI, to catalyze the sector, and essentially encourage the commercial banks, which were not doing on lending or lending to agriculture, but use this as a vehicle. So we believe with the introduction and the restructuring of the sector, especially introduction of a DFI specific for resource mobilization, and at the same time having the commercial banks with proper products which are aligned to the demand of the market. So I think the biggest question for very few, and we have noted, first of all, was on the perception on the sector. Perception was always agriculture is a risk area. But in the end, I think we forgot that agriculture contributes about 25% of the country GDP. So this is the engine of the country. This is the engine of the economy. You talk about employment, and the data have given us numbers. This is contributing 2/3 of the employment of our Tanzania. So critically, more resources from mainstream financial sectors are required really to come so that they support agriculture sector. But second for me, apart from number 1, which was the perception on risk side, I think second and the key item was on the bank's design of products which will really support the growth in the agriculture sector. I normally tell people agriculture lending is an art. It's not a matter of checklist, where you have your checklist and you wait someone to knock the door, and then you go through 15 points and say this guy qualified. I'm sure you won't lend in agriculture. It's all about an art. It's about a conversation you are having with whoever is involved in the value chain. You support him, and one client totally differ with the next client. And I think the generalization aspect has costed us much, where everybody talks about agriculture. Agriculture is very broad. I think we now need to zoom in, get into value chain, get into subsectors, and then start a conversation all the way and design transactions or design loans or design fund mobilization based on the structure or on a subsector instead on the generalization aspect. So I see a positive growth, which you've noted. The number was even below 5%, but now we've hit 8.8% growth in agriculture in terms of banks lending. And I foresee that it's going to be even much stronger. The narrative is changing. Everybody now is talking agriculture as an investment area. Back in the days, everybody thought agriculture like poor for the poor. But now, agriculture is a lifestyle. And people, you see middle class getting into agriculture aggressively. For me, this, if you have middle class coming in, that offers room to develop nucleus farmers who will impact the society around them. So agriculture-wise, we see the restructuring of the transactions, the designing should be aligned to the vision of the country, which is we transform industrialization through agriculture. That's key for me.
Thank you, Japhet. This leads us quite nicely to our successful farmer that we have on the panel, Mr. Franklin Bagala. You're the CEO of Tomoni Farms. Can you tell us a little bit about your farm? What has led to your success or attracted you to agriculture? Did you have any access to funding? And how have you managed to get the farm to where it is today?
Well, successful? Yeah, we'll get there. Let me explain what we exactly do. And whatever we're doing, we've been doing it for the past 7 years. We have a dream that will probably be successful after 15 years. Basically what we do, we invest in a horticulture value chain. We have a 250-acre, that's about a 100-hectare farm, and we have logistics facilities, and we do a bit of value addition to the produce that come from our farm. But we've also got about 104 farmers that produce pineapples on a 50-acre farmland, and they are guaranteed support from us from preparation of the land, the knowledge on how to grow pineapples, and they are guaranteed selling all those pineapples to us. So yes, we've had access to funding, as expensive as it is. Yeah, but we've had access. We've used it. The fact that we're on a 7th year and we're still running, and we're still supporting, it means that agriculture works. Do we have an impact on the societies? I think we have. If I have to give an example of what is happening now, in a village where we farm, the road to the village is broken at this stage. You know, the rains have broken the road. The government can't fix, immediately. And the crops can't wait, for the roads to be fixed. So literally, the villagers can't sell their produce because, the traders can't get into the villages. But because of our investment in the village, we have trucks on the other side of the village, and we have another truck on the other side, of the road. So what we're doing currently, we're getting our stuff from our farm and from our outgrowers to the point where the road is broken, shift everything to the other truck, and we're able to get the produce to our processing facility. And it means the people that we're working, the 104 farmers that we're working, and in any other scenario, they would have lost all their produce at this stage. But at the moment, they are able to sell all their produce to us because we're buying all of it, and we have the facilities that are helping them. We're able to, to consume or to absorb everything they've produced. So the challenge we're facing now is every other villager is trying to get ways of getting their produce, the ones that we're not working officially with. They're also trying to get their produce to us. Our capacity at this stage does not allow us. So, we've had to have people, stationed in the, outgrowers' farms to make sure we're only collecting what comes from the outgrowers' farms. But again, in terms of our employment, at any given point in time, we have about 20 people, at our farm. We have 2 permanent graduate employees who support our outgrowers, throughout, in terms of knowledge, in terms of, how to grow and process their produce. So yes, it's not an easy task, but we're up to it, and hopefully we'll become successful.
Thank you very much. I would like to come back to Holger, if I may. You obviously have experience across multiple African countries in the region. So we would love to know, maybe from you, what examples you could cite of profound agricultural transformation in the region.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is this on?
Yes.
It is on, good. As you were speaking, Franklin, I actually thought like perhaps we need to do a little competition. I need to raise funds with Bella. we need to do a competition to find a better term than like medium-sized farmers. That just doesn't capture it. Emerging farmers also doesn't capture it. I think there is this entrepreneurial like segment that we really need a different term for, because any other existing term just leads the discussion down the wrong way. So in terms of like examples, striking examples of agricultural transformation, this is a really difficult one, right? Because see, transformation, of course, I mean, I don't want to deliver a lecture on what constitutes transformation and what not. I think some of the classical elements, shift in labor composition and increase in labor productivity, and so we've captured. But in terms of like real examples where change is happening, I think like across the continent, we do see unmistakable signs of an agriculture transformation happening in the majority of countries. There are always pockets that are a little more problematic. If I'm being asked, like, where is it happening? I have to talk about Senegal, where due to like consistency in its incentives and also the right location and the enabling environment, there's a horticulture boom happening that really shifts the face of semi-Sahelian agriculture. I have to think of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, who now take a completely different approach, or are about to take a different approach to their cocoa marketing. They account for 2/3 of the world's cocoa production, but generate only like 6% of the world's value added. So a shift is underway, also driven by economic considerations. I think a really like phenomenal transformation underway, not much talked about, is what's happening in neighboring Uganda at this point in time in the north of the country. It's what I would call an agricultural, sometimes I write agricultural evolution with an R in front, agriculture revolution. Where in the north, actually the entire like agribusiness regime is being ran by processors and marketers, and all of a sudden they come in and provide the public good of infrastructure, of quality assurance, of advisory services, of mechanization. And perhaps in that case, I know it's a brave statement, but perhaps it's because the state there has decided not to interfere. So we can distinguish between cases where the state has very actively facilitated transformation, Senegal, cases where the state has not, northern Uganda, a fantastic case. And I don't want to go down the way of describing examples where I think statal policy has actively hindered structural transformation from happening. This can, for instance, happen further south without naming countries, when regularly governments interfere with the ability of maize producers to supply foreign markets. And then, of course, there is little incentive to become more productive or invest in a longer range. Franklin just said his vision is one of 15 years. See, I think there are a couple of, let me close on that, a couple of common lessons we learn from transformation experiences. One is consistency. Consistency over time. See, many of the big global examples of agriculture transformation would not have been possible if our patience had been a 4 years or an 8 years project cycle. Brazil, the opening up of the Cerrado, Brazil becoming the world's largest supplier of commodities such as soy and maize, was possible only because of 25 years and more of consistent investment into soil fertility management, but also into research, Embrapa, right? See consistency also in terms of what you fund. Little Uruguay, Latin America, neatly tucked away between that Brazil that I just talked about and the Argentina. 3 million head of cattle has propelled itself within 15 years to the top bracket of red meat marketers, wool marketers, citrus fruit marketers because all their public support has been conditioned on two factors. They would only support quality enhancement investment and resilience investment. Everything else on a farm would not qualify for support or in the industry. And then the last universal lesson is that when you want to support or facilitate structural change, please think first and foremost of how to compensate the losers. And or those that, see, I mean, just talking about shedding labor force doesn't help us if we have no idea on how to compensate. This is important if we want to facilitate intergenerational asset transfer, what a word, right? But I mean, the handing over of productive asset land, for instance, to the younger generation. I mean, processes can be put in place to facilitate this, but we cannot just go into a policy where we say, okay, we support a couple of like successful enterprises and we don't think about the inclusive principles that some of you have also alluded to.
Thank you, Holger. I want to kind of move back to Professor Nyange, if I may, and I want to hear the government's perspective, I guess, on how they should be involved in catalyzing agricultural transformation.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I think the first step is to spread that message to the government and the policymakers. I would say this is a new trend. Myself, I've been working in the agricultural sector for over 20 years. Time, I'm seeing this happening. And I remember when we shared the statistics early on in the study with colleagues at the World Bank, we asked ourselves, is this really, is it on papers or it's translated into actual situations in the rural areas? And we set out and went to the field, and I would say the experience was overwhelming. And since then, we've been producing small video clips, to demonstrate how the sector is transforming. Now, I would say from the development perspective in agriculture, I would say this is a game changer because traditionally we have been working in a sector with a dichotomy where you have smallholder farmers on one hand and the large commercial farms on the other hand. And we've been struggling to match these smallholder farmers with large-scale farms in form of what growers schemes and contractive farming. But because of the differences in terms of technology, in terms of levels of location, the success has been modest. But now with the rise of these medium-sized farms, I think it's a new window of opportunities because these medium-sized farms, first, are much closer to smallholder farmers. And of course, the evidence has already shown that there's a spillover effect between these medium-sized farms and the smallholder farms. So what the government needs to do, first, it needs to increase its investment in the sector. Both public and private sector investments are needed in order to scale up these early results that we are seeing now. Second, there's need to improve the business environment to make sure that the policy environment is predictable and also address the fundamental issues that are constraining the sector. For example, the regulatory framework. And finally, if it's possible, it would be good to have specialized or targeted incentives to the sector. For example, the lessons we learned from the region, in most countries in the region, the corporate taxes are around 30%, but countries like Zambia and Mozambique have preferential corporate tax for agriculture and agribusiness, which is 10%. And we are currently dialoguing with the government on providing such an incentive to the sector.
Thank you, Professor Nyange. I'm going to jump back to Japheth because we've just talked about the importance of investment in the sector. And I'm wondering how we can unlock more access to finance and also if you could provide some insights on how this can be fostered. So more private and public investment in agriculture.
Thank you so much. It was such a pertinent question. And to be honest, we need resources. And resources will continue to be at the center. And resources also differ. If you look at today, I go back to banking because that's key. You talk about 80% of the loan to deposit ratio, which means they've spent at least 80% of every 100 they have already lending on other sectors, and they've only remained with 20%. So you can see we are pushing toward the ceiling. And that tells us there is quite a serious need on raising additional resources through concessional loans, of which, like we in TADB, we are one of the beneficiaries in 2017, where we managed to source more than $90 million and another $20 million. So we believe raising additional resources will be critical, especially on investment. But apart from that, is also resources also need to be driven per project. So especially on product like guarantee schemes, we have been running a guarantee scheme for past 1 year, and we've seen quite a strong growth where we have at least 80 banks now, and we managed to mobilize the money. So we believe by building up more on guarantee arrangements, that will push more private sector or more banks to get involved in it. But I think one thing which is not being discussed several times in several conversations is how to support the startups. You cannot support them using the current banking structure. And these startups start from the farmers, the youths who are getting into the sector with no even 1 year of experience, or you find youths who are involved in technology development or technology design. Still, we don't have quite a solid startup fund where we'll say this youth will start with this money for year 1, year 2, and then when they graduate, they get into the formal sector. So I believe a forum like this one, the start like this one, which has come forward, it's a real calling for restructuring, especially on how the resources will come forward. I'll give you a simple case. In 1979, I was just reading a World Bank appraisal paper, and it was on a Tanzania DFI called the Tanzania Development Finance Company, which was Agricultural Development Bank. That was 1971. You know who were the funders who put capital in it or equity in it? One was the TIB, Tanzania Investment Bank. Second was CDC from UK, and third was FMO, and the fourth was KFW. So this was used to engineer the transformation in the agriculture sector. And if you you go back with records, you realize in the 70s, this country was not even importing clothes. We were planting our cotton in the same time the processing was happening in this country, where there were more than 10 factories in textile alone. So we believe these glory days, and the funding back then, there were only 9 banks. Today you've got 60 banks, and still you have got the misalignment. So we believe coming together again, like these forums, like these studies coming forward, like researcher side, all this should bring us all together in having concerted efforts toward the specific value chains where we can see direct impact. Because I'll tell you, for past 18 months, we've put down more than 150 billion in this in agriculture sector alone. But in the end, we believe our money was just a catalyst. We know that we did projects more than 150. For us, these are projects. These are not loans. They've got ecosystems behind them. So you expect somewhere you'll have people to be trained, you'll have smallholders to be supported in opening markets. So our money is going in on agro-processing level to unlock the value chain and bring in more players to come together. So I believe proper structured financing and resource mobilization will take us a place. And like my colleague have said, cocoa alone in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, they've managed to raise $600 million to revive the entire value chain. If I give you a simple case today on the Tanzania cashew nut, simply look at it. We expect this year to raise more than 300 million kilos. Every kilo is going to cost, the farmer will be getting around 2,700. So you're talking about 810 billion will be paid to the farmers. But the entire stock, 90%, will be shipped to open up markets in other countries. Taking the number back, by only involved into the cashew nut processing in country, if we come together, put up all resources and say, you know what, we're going to do this as an example. You know what will happen? By just selling or converting, because to every 1 kg of kernels, you need 3 raw cashew nuts. So for the 300 million kilos, you have to generate like 85 million kilos. This 85 million kilo, on average, 1 kg is fetching around $6.9. In this economy, by just mobilizing processing of cashew in country, you'll be generating additional 1.3 trillion in the economy. That's additional 500 billion for kernels alone. I'm not talking about the juice which is coming out of it. I'm not talking about the biomass or the biofuel which is coming out of the nuts. So you're talking about quite a huge economy. The only challenge we have, everybody is hitting from every corner. Can we come together, put the resources together, and we say, we're going to attack this monster called cashew nut, and we put the resources together. We unlock one transaction. I believe we'll be able to set the tone and be able to attract even more players, and I think that would be a best way for it.
Thank you for those insights and ideas. I'm going to ask quite a difficult question of you, Dr. Kilama, if I may. We've heard the good news that Tanzania is performing well in terms of economic growth, but this doesn't seem to balance with the rate of poverty reduction. So I'm wondering why that is, and what role does agriculture have to play in that?
Thank you, Miranda. And I don't think it's a question that one can do justice to it in 2 or 3 minutes. But then given the discussion that we're having today, and perhaps I pick already from Japhet here, he spoke on cashew. Just very quickly from what he said, you can say cashew is that one crop that is cultivated by the poor, enjoyed by the rich. So already, if we do what he just said, then you've sorted the question that you've just asked me. But it's not as simple as that. What Japhet has just indicated is it's very important when we're saying somehow we are growing, but it's only a certain part of the country that is growing. So if we are to intervene, it means for the case where I'm just going to use the evidence that was just shared here, because I've also worked a little bit on cashew. It will be, for the lack of words, I'm not going to say naive, it will be very difficult to lift people out of poverty if we simply selectively intervene. So we pick one actor and we say we're providing incentives to the farmer. But according to Japhet here, not only do we have to provide incentive to the researchers so that they come with better a breed, not only do we need to provide incentive to the traders so that they can efficiently transport the cashew, not only should we provide better incentives to the primary society, but also the guys that are helping out with cooperative societies also. We also have to do that. And the sort of investment is not just about money, just like he has put it. We want a holistic approach that not only takes care of the ecosystem, but at the same time understand the other things that are ongoing within the particular area. So let's go back to the same example. If we say, I am a cashew farmer, what do I use my money for? And I say, I can only take my children to school once I'm paid from cashew. And I said, okay, but your child, let's say, has just graduated. What else can they do? And then they say, we want to process. What kind of money should we put in? And we're not talking about just easy processing here. Processing by the standards that are required. And I think in Tanzania, that's a big, big struggle. We add value, so what? Are we adding value targeting a market? If I want to go and sell in Middle East, what are the standards required there? It should not be anybody else who does not know how the market is working stipulating to me. It should be the market in the Middle East that I'm looking forward tells me these are the standards that you need to adhere to, and I adhere to that. And anything that might hinder me generate or produce things at the required standard should be clear. And we've seen a lot of efforts in the country recently trying to really clear out some of the hurdles that we are facing. Now, because we know as today, we've heard a lot about the Mido farmer doing very well, and they also have all this assured market through processing and all that. It means for us to include also the smaller farmers to produce the required amount at the right quality, then we will start seeing progress. They will also start demanding other things. Sometimes when you have money is when you demand it, but when you don't have, you're like, you end up like, you know, I'm still thinking about it. But I have money, come on. I will think about different ways. So for me, the biggest part will be, it is important to take care of these various groups that are still lagging behind, to be included innovatively in all these different nodes of the value chain. So whether it's at the production level, whether it's at processing, whether it's at transporting, whether it's at value adding, also doing it without losing so much money, so that at the end of the day, it should not be directed by people who are not involved. So I really liked, I think, the presentation that was made, that spearheaded, by Adi, that said, in order for us to reduce poverty, then you need the private sector to be at the forefront. And since the private sector work closely with all these different actors, they set the standards. And it's not just their own standard, the standard that will give them the premier returns, the people that you want them to spearhead all this process. So for me, if we do it that way, then you will see something. And a small note that I want to share. Sometimes when we speak about agriculture, and we've seen this coming out from evidence, and I like the exercise that you started up this morning when you asked us to rise whether we engage in agriculture in one way or the other. I think we need to think also at the back of our minds, when we are thinking of agriculture, is it my sole source of income, or is it an alternative? Is it I go and try something else and I bounce, I come back to agriculture? Or is it something that once I am engaged in, I don't want to use the word I'm stuck for life, but it is something that I'll continue to do and everybody else will depend on it. So for me, I think it's important when we look at agriculture, we have to understand even the differences that we had today. We have to remember, if I am investing in a business, let's say outside agriculture, any non-farm, if I'm hit on that side, I come back to agriculture and I'm like, whew, at least I can eat. And if you start criticizing me for being small in agriculture, I'm like, hey, this thing assures me at least I will always eat. But then we're saying if we want to transform, we want to see more people in industry, more people in services. Only if those two areas are secured enough and people will feel the returns they're getting from there, they will stay there. But otherwise, agriculture will always have some space somewhere. So I know it's a big question, but for me, when I think about poverty and the economy, those kind of things can come to my mind. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Kilama. You talked a lot there about standards and quality, and I think I just want to ask Mr. Bagala there. You talk about collaborating with smaller farmers, small commercialized farmers, so small and medium, working together. How do you maintain quality? How do you adhere to the right standards when you're selling your product? And are there any final ideas you have for catalyzing agricultural transformation in the country from the front line?
One big thing that I've spoken about over and over again, with all the ideas that we're discussing here, it all comes with knowledge. If you look at how agriculture knowledge is disseminated in this country, then you realize that's where we have the fundamental problem. I developed my farming passion way back in primary school. We had a subject called agriculture science. And at our primary school, we had a school garden. And I loved my pawpaw and I loved my banana. And it would always be a pleasure go work in a garden because I would have access to a pawpaw and a banana. And we had this passionate teacher, agriculture teacher, who had a backyard garden at his house. And he grew all these sort of nice, good stuff, you know, the cabbages and the bananas and the pawpaw and all these good things that we like. It's that little knowledge that I had in primary school that I grew up with, that even when I came to invest in agriculture, it was that knowledge that I had in primary school that, you know, I invested on, you know, and but if you come to think about it, you know, I don't know what happened. That subject isn't being taught in schools again. I don't know what happened. But what I've come to realize is the agricultural knowledge is so patched up that everybody knows a different thing. I meet agronomists, you know. I try and look for a solution for one thing. I meet 5 or 6 agronomists. They tell me 5, 6 different things. And it's what they were either taught or experienced somewhere. And when I hire people to come and work at my farm or, you know, in the processing, they don't bring any knowledge. They bring the labor, you know. So I have to tell them what to do. You do this, you do that, you do that. You know, this is how we grow a tree, this is how we buddy, this is how we graft, you know, because it's not a public knowledge, which it should be. Yeah, so what can we do? I think we need more public investment in agriculture knowledge. How we do that? I don't know. There should be a lot of ways. You first have got to have enough teachers in primary schools, in secondary schools, teaching. If we're talking about agriculture transforming, it has to start. People have to live it. And where do they live it? In their daily lives. They go to school, they hear, you know, the knowledge that I've been out to acquire, you know, I've given it back to the society. Because I'll give you an example. Before we went to that village, and Professor has been to that village, Dr. Klama, you've been to that village. People grow pineapples, and they believed 500 seedlings were enough for an acre. Until we got to that village and told them, you know what? That productivity will never give you any money. In an acre, you need to have a minimum of 10,000 seedlings. Oops. Oh, okay. So where do we get 10,000 seedlings? You know? And I go back and say, okay, I'll give you the seedlings, but this is what you do. On a daily basis, I have to tell them this is how you plant, this is how you weed, these are the fertilizers that you have got to use, and that's noble. The mother, the father, the son, the daughter will have that knowledge for the rest of their lives. And that's the impact we've had back to the society.
Thank you for that. So knowledge, education, and perhaps having it as a subject in primary schools even, once again, as you've shared. Thank you very much, Mr. Bagal. I would really love to open up to the floor if anyone has any burning questions. Do we have any questions from the floor for any of the panelists? Yes, madam. Is it possible for us to get a microphone to the lady here in the center? Thank you. Please just state your name, your organization, and if the question is directed to someone in particular on the panel.
Teresa Kaijaga is my name. I chair social work at Hubert Kairuki Memorial University, and I teach ethics. And, you know, in a clinical setting, when we talk of informed consent, there are models and, you know, in a hospital setting, when you tell a patient, this is the procedure, these are the alternatives, these are the risks, Do I go on with the procedure or do I not? Sign here. Now, in a farm setting, you go either as a researcher or as a buyer or as a politician pushing a certain agenda. What is informed consent like? If I prepare my social work students to back you up, what do they say to the small farmers, smallholder? When I target the household, what are the social workers to help you with? How do we, you talk of resilience. What is resilience like for this farmer who you are targeting for a new product and this transformation when he relies on the weather and there is drought and all the whatever he was promised goes down the drain? Resilience in a hospital setting, my student knows, resilience in this farm for this small farmer who has just been sold this product and was hoping to really transform. Usually in our setting, nobody goes back to this farmer. And my social work student is telling me, you are sending me to a new territory, and I don't have a lot of support there. I have all these agricultural economists, I have all these engineers, I have all this. What do I say to the farmer? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So a question there on resilience. I'm not sure if, Professor, you want to take that one?
It's about maybe informed consent to farmers. I totally agree that the way agriculture knowledge is disseminated to farmers, sometimes there's no mechanism to protect the farmer or to ensure the farmer against a known situation. For example, in case of a change in price in the market or in case of an outbreak of a pestilence. But I would say systems are gradually developing, particularly for, with the contract farming, where farmers may get into agreement with a private company for them to grow a particular crop and for the company to provide some services, whether it's extension services to the farmer, and then the farmer will have an obligation to sell their produce to the company. The legal framework is still being worked out, and I think that's one of the laws that currently the ministry is trying to work. But I would say there are also kind of private practices which are being promoted. But alternatively, crop insurance is also evolving, just to make sure that in case of, let's say, a situation that would lead a farmer into loss, he or she can be compensated. But touching base a little bit on the quality of extension service that my brother Franklin here was talking about, I would say there are two parts of knowledge, or three parts of knowledge as far as agriculture is concerned. We have the first part, which I would call it science or technical knowledge. And this is the knowledge that usually the extension workers will get from a college or university. And then there's a second part of knowledge, which is technology. Technology usually comes from the private sector and usually is driven by the private sector. In fact, what is being put into practice is technology rather than science, where a farmer would maybe need assistance to install a drip irrigation system, or maybe would want to do some grafting in his seedling, and that's technology, and that is normally driven by the private sector. And then you also have the other element, which is entrepreneurship. So an idyllic situation would be where a farmer will be able to access a full package. The challenge that Tanzania has, I would say, the private sector in agriculture is still very thin. So most extension services are not exposed to technology. But with this transformation, we hope eventually we'll be able to build a critical mass of extension staff with both science and exposure to technology, but also to entrepreneurship. Yeah, where a farmer, for example, an extension staff would approach a farmer, showing him a farm budget, how much they are going to incur in producing a particular crop, what type of pesticide to use, varieties to use, expected yields, and the potential price in the market. So a farmer to make an informed decision. I would say that's an area that needs to be strengthened to improve the quality of extension service.
Thank you. I'm wondering if Holger wanted to add to that. Have you seen some best practice on quality extension services in other countries?
I have my microphone here, I forgot. Ma'am, I find your question thought-provoking, and I thank you for that. The informed consent question, see, unfortunately and fortunately, agriculture is this hugely complex activity that depends on so many different interactions. If we compare like a surgery or medication type of informed consent on the farm, I would compare it to a fertilizer decision or a pesticide decision or a single intervention. None of us here on the panel sits here to sell a certain product or a certain intervention. What unites us here is that we're making an observation that there are a couple of universal factors that obviously make for more effective, positive change in the agriculture sector. So what are these like common no regret options, right? A little productive diversification. So not just relying like on one crop all the years on the same spot. Helps tremendously with making farms more resilient, so able to bounce back if something happens. And that something might be the weather, but that something might also just be turbulent markets, domestic or international. So diversification to a degree helps, and I'm very happy to discuss what is that degree. We don't want to go to the nth degree. Soil fertility investment do help. More soils that have more organic substance, hold water better, hold nutrients better, bounce back faster. Don't want to go into details. We do see that in regions where we have agile farmers, so let me call it agile farmers rather than like market-oriented smallholders and medium-sized farmers, agile farmers, those attract more services and private sector activity, and overall farmers then have better access to what they really need to be good farmers. In closing, I think we need to be very cognizant, and I have not gone there so explicitly, so let me do it now. Within the smallholder population, there are two types of farms. There are the farm-oriented, the market-oriented ones. They will appreciate a lot having that agility and that private sector around. They will like prosper under those circumstances. But there is a segment of smallholders, and you alluded to it, that do not really want to become commercial, have no potential to become commercial. And then perhaps the role of the state is to provide good social and socio-economic support rather than selling a productive solution which doesn't help. Sometimes we see that a minister of agriculture does not have the instruments for those farmers in their toolbox. There is there is a relevance of social protection also in the rural space. Under hardship, a minister of agriculture usually can't do that, or would not be the right person to do it. There is a role for the regulations, the regulatory domain that we address. See, land rights for both gender and land rights for the population overall is also not actually a domain for a minister of agriculture. So I thank you for a thought-provoking question. Unfortunately, the informed consent thingy doesn't really apply in such a complex system. But if we break it down into the individual intervention, I think we all have a pretty good understanding of what are the no-regret options that a government can invest into to strengthen this very positive trend that we observe at this point in time in Tanzania.
Thank you very much. I hope your question was answered, but also feel free to approach any of the panelists during lunch as well for more detail. We've got time for two last questions. Yes, we've got a question on the front here. And is there one more, just so we can take both questions? So we'll go here, three more. So 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
My name is Geoffrey Kirenga. I work in the agricultural sector in an institution known as SACCOT, the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania. This morning has been a rewarding morning because most of the news here were good news. It creates hope and it energizes us. And also it's an opportunity to get a feedback that the work that we've been doing for the past 5 to 10 years, we are starting to see the results, especially with the grown population of this missing middle and the kind of services that are being offered by that group, producing almost 40% of the produce that is entering in the market and those millions of employments. That is very good news. I'm also particularly interested on the role of the interdependence of the medium-scale farmers, those emerging farmers, and established businesses, whether in farming or related services. And that is where most of the knowledge trickles down. Tomoni's farmers, you said how many acres? 50 acres? Yeah. 50 acres. These 50 acres doing horticulture are medium-scale farmers in their own right, in terms of value and also the size of the farm. The knowledge that Tomoni is providing to those farmers, skills and experience, leave alone the market, is extremely important. And we see these farmers and the businesses, whether you are in inputs, fertilizer, agrochemicals, and also other products that are needed, mechanization, storage. These are provides the network and also the ecosystems that allows the medium-scale farmers to grow. And in a way also supports the smallholder farmers. But their role is not properly captured. I see a great opportunity for that knowledge to be more democratized, more accessible in that kind of a rich environment compared to that extension worker service, which is increasingly becoming limited because there's much more interest now, much more diversified and more complex environment. So we need to create a system and support that supports the agribusinesses to work more efficiently and more supportively to the medium and small scale producers. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. I believe you were also supposed to be with us on the panel as well, so I appreciate your contribution. Do you want to go next, since the microphone's on the table, and then we'll come to you, sir?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Penel Limo. I'm a retired public servant. And I think my first comment is that I think this analytic work really has come at the right time. I think we have really good news. You know, given the uniquely strategic position of agriculture in development, of course, one would have expected that this would have come a little bit much earlier. But it's better late than never. I think my first point is that, which is coming out of this presentation, is that really agriculture is now, in terms of the medium-sized farms, it is really going more and more into business. And I think this is really the message that needs to be propelled forward, that we should not just talk about agriculture, not just talk about farming, we should talk about agribiz. Because I don't think Tomon went into farming because they wanted to produce food. They want to do business. And I think this is the mindset which needs to be really introduced in the farming in Tanzania. It's not farming for food, but it is farming for business. And the banks are not going to lend because they want people to produce food, because they want people to do business. And I think this reorientation, thinking, and the change of mindset has to transact throughout all the key players that really are involved in the sector. Because I think for too long, there's been this attitude of, you go into agriculture for food, but really, that's now out of date. You see, we know some farmers are making more money from cereals than from the traditional, so-called traditional cash crops. So it's not about food, it's not about farming, it's about business. So if it's about business, that's how we can attract new farmers. Because I don't think young people, they want to go into farming just for the sake of farming. They want to have gainful employment, they want to make money. And I think this is what is going to change the attitude. And this is really what is going to bring about transformation. That is my first comment. My second comment is that I think in terms of the targeted, samples that have been presented here, you see really a very positive, change. But I think you don't see them so much at the global level. If you look at agriculture performance as a whole, over the past decade or so, you look at productivity as a whole, you really don't get that picture of that transformation. Productivity is still very low in agriculture. The use of improved seed, use of fertilizer is still very low. I think the current use is about 19 kilos of active ingredients per hectare, but we have a target of about 50 according to the Abuja, declaration. So we still have got a long way to go in this context. My final point again on these, medium-sized farms is that I think this is good, positive information. But I think what is lacking is that we don't have information on what is happening to the existing farmers. Who is changing? Because if I give the example of maize, according to the annual agricultural sample census of 2016-2017, out of the 8.6 million hectares which were planted with cereals, 6.1 million hectares were planted with maize, which is about 70%. So you can see the huge population that is just involved in one crop. So I think for us to be able to see how we carry this work forward is to see how this transformation happening in the different commodity value chains. Is it just happening in a particular value chain like horticulture, or is it a cross-cutting type of transformation? So I think if we have some additional information on this really will inform and give better, evidence to policymakers on really what is possible to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm wondering if, before we move on to the next questions, I know we've got one there, and the UN Women representative and the gentleman over there. Is there more information within the report? Holger, you could just expand a little bit?
Yes. Thank you very much, Piers Limo. Much appreciate your thoughts and your questions. See, the economic update, for all good reasons, has a relatively concise chapter on the phenomenon. It's, I think, 25 pages. There's a voluminous body of analytical underpinning. And so I'm asking myself, how can I best get it to you? What I recommend is that if you are interested in the underpinning analytical work, and that relates to a number of the phenomena you've been alluding to. So is this cross-cutting, or does it just pertain to one or two value chains? It is cross-cutting. That's what we see at this point in time. Is it participatory? Yes, we see it. We do see the private sector-led advisory services also, Jeffrey, that you have been alluding to. So perhaps the best way of doing it is approach our local office here in Dar es Salaam, approach Emma Isinika Modamba, who led the work on this. Emma, where are you? Can you stand up for a moment? There's Emma. So Emma is your point, your contact point, or even myself during the break, and we take your coordinates, and we are happy to send you background work on the spillover effects of that phenomenon on poverty, on the structural change overall and assessment, but we also have dedicated pieces done in the background on the natural resource side. So very, very happy to share open access, full access to it. I want to, perhaps also in response to the two questions, a very quick additional comment. you might dislike for the term medium-sized farmer, right? But even if we stick with it for a moment, these farms are not large by any means. I mean, they are still like relatively modest in size. They are a little larger than your usual smallholder, but we're not talking about like big, fat agricultural holdings run by some abstract business. It is Tanzanians, entrepreneurs that invest into agri-food. It has been around for a good 10 years. One of the key reasons that we didn't see it coming to the degree we did see it is, first, people like us, Professor, usually need a certain period until we really realize that structural change is happening. But we've also been basing our assessments on a certain set of statistics. And these are called household surveys, panel data. And there's something really interesting about farmers like you. You are not really a household farm. And so this phenomenon was not captured, or only captured with a certain lag in statistics. This is a really interesting one. So it's not something that emerged like last year and all of a sudden we wake up to it and write a report over it. It was just a recognition gap, almost, a recognition lag in getting this done. But it is a sustained phenomenon.
Thank you. Now, just in the interest of time, we have 3 people that will ask a question. So we'll take all 3. If you could please try and keep them short and sweet. So we'll start here, and then Madam here in the front table, and the UN Women representative.
Thank you so much. My name is Fortson Kafweku. I'm the country representative for BRAC International, which is basically a microfinance and social development program organization. I have one question, I think particularly addressed to Professor Nyage. I know earlier on he had talked about some of the things that needs to be done in order for Tanzania to be ready to grow the agriculture sector and also ensure that it's well represented. And one of them was increasing the investment and having really targeted incentives for the farmers. And I think from the statistics that I can see in this report about, for example, the job creation is about 67% of jobs are in the agriculture sector, which for me gives us an indication that, if anything, this is the area that needs to be supported. And for me, learning from other countries that I've worked in, I come from the Southern Africa, and when I compare Southern Africa and Tanzania, Tanzania can actually be the breadbasket for Africa. Because what is happening in the southern part of the country is scary, around climate change. You know what is happening in Zambia, in Zimbabwe. I come from Zambia. Right now we are getting emergency food relief from WFP, which was not happening in the last maybe 15, 20 years ago. Zambia was producing a lot of food, which is exporting and feeding countries like DRC, Malawi, and other places. But looking at Tanzania, every piece of Tanzania has got food. In Lusaka alone, you cannot find the food that I find here in Tanzania. Everywhere you go, there are bananas, there are sweet potatoes, there are pineapples, and everything else. So what is it that this country has to do to ensure that it can move to the level where it can feed Africa? I think there are many things. The issue of climate change. If there's a lot of investment around that area, that can help this country move to another level. I see the kind of deforestation that is happening in this country is scary. Every corner there's woodwork. Every house has got panels of wood. Even here, I was at Serena the other day. I was amazed to see the kind of wood that is in that hall. You know, but what is the government doing to ensure that those trees are planted? The use of wood is regulated, because that is the area where we're going to see, if we are not managing that very well, we will see all the soils, all the trees go, and the next thing is going to be a desert. The area of risk transfer, I think the Development Bank needs to look at that. Most of the farmers are really not being supported because they can't do business, because no one is ready to take the risk. So I think some of those areas need to be really looked into. Enabling environment in terms of sending, putting a lot of money in this sector, that is the only area that can help us move to another level. So I thought I should just mention those 3 points and probably maybe hear a reaction from Professor Nyage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If we could, will you remember all of that, Professor, yeah? If we could take the microphone to the lady on the front table and then to the UN Women representative, and then we'll answer and close in the interest of time. Please keep it very brief.
Thank you very much. My name is Mwatima Juma, and I work for International Fund for Agriculture Development. Maybe I could be mistaken, but My take here is that we are doing very well. We are transforming, but resources, public resources that goes into agricultures are dwindling. So I would like to know what makes us get that transformation away from the need of the public resources. And then I will ask myself, how can we focus? We talk about SDP2. We are very happy of the document. How can we focus the limited resource to do those things that are really crucial to support that move? Because it's not enough, and the transforming is happening. How we can transform better by focusing those limited resources that we have in the public funds. And one of the area I will also support the young men here is the knowledge. Most of these people, when we go there and we work with them in support as a program or project, they ask us, where have you been? Why didn't you tell me this before? And for me, that is too much. Then I need fertilizer. They have moved away from that. I need fertilizer, I need seeds, I need that. They want knowledge. They want to see how they could be organized. So when we put them up into consortium, into platform, into how they can go to Kenya to look for the market for their onions and then come back and get themselves organized, and get somebody to help them to build up a structure, to keep their maize, to keep their onions, to separate them, to get the market, they don't need us anymore. And for me, the limited resources, because every time we'll make a noise like Ministry of Agriculture is not getting enough budget for agriculture. What exactly it should use that budget for? What exactly? Because agriculture is private, and if what exactly it is used to is that knowledge bit. And how to, I don't know, maybe it needs to be worked out. And then when we go to SDP2, we have much more focused in terms of what intervention we want to do to see progress into that, away from 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, project support on this commodity. Next time we jump into another commodity. Today sunflower, tomorrow is oil palm. We don't fix things. We are moving around too much in that one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Was that directed to anyone in particular?
Did you direct anybody?
Directed to anyone in particular? To Helga. Okay.
Yeah.
UN Women Representative.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to be really quick. I just want to follow up on a point that Dr. Belinda had referred to in terms of inclusivity, especially for women and so forth. We know that in agriculture, majority of the farmers are women, and you know, feeding that nation is not a small task, and it's not something that we should, you know, undervalue. So I wanted to sort of look at, maybe with the work that the study that you've done on this important topic, how do we ensure that, you know, the constraints that women farmers have, how do we help them to, you know, move into this other level of middle scale farming? Because in your point you were referring to, who is it, you were saying, you know, whom should we support? And I thought you were going to perhaps maybe unpack that and see whether, you know, the majority are women farmers. How do we help them to address, you know, in terms of policies and so forth? The national, I mean, the Ministry of Gender is now going through this policy review on agriculture, and they're making an effort to ensure that the gender gaps in agricultural productivity are better addressed. But how do we ensure that this transformation is inclusive, given the fact that there are so many challenges that women farmers are having, women in business are having, in terms of access to financial resources, access to information, technology, you know, even, you know, the small things and so forth. How do we help them to move forward so that there is inclusive growth, and at the same time you are addressing productivity, and really building on that previous study that the World Bank had, the previous economic growth update, which was looking at investing in human capital. We can't really see a transformation of our agricultural sector if we do not ensure that the environment, the whole ecosystem is conducive for women. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Hodan. So what we will do to answer the questions, we'll start with Professor Nyange, we'll come to Holger, who I think both questions were directed to you, and then we'll hear some final remarks from Mr. Bakala, from Japheth, sorry, and Dr. Kilama as well, before we close this panel session. So, Professor.
Okay, I would say the questions are very broad, so I'll just comment briefly. The first one from Brack on regional trade, I would say yes, there's a great opportunity for Tanzania to engage in regional trade. Currently in Africa, intra-regional trade is about 15%, and for East Africa, which is considered to have advanced, is 18%. And this is far below inter-regional trade in Asia, which is around 60%. And one potential area for promoting inter-regional trade is in food trade. As you know, with traditional export, most countries are producing traditional exports. So it's quite a challenge to trade among countries. But when it comes to food, you have quite a good mix of food deficit and food surplus countries. In the last season of the 14 East, Central, and Southern African countries, only 2 had a surplus, and that's Tanzania and Uganda. And there are some lessons we draw very much for a country like Uganda. In the last 3 years, they have been able to increase their maize export from 1 million tons from 300,000 tons to 1 million tons. And the production has expanded currently from 1 million tons to 3 million tons. And they've been able to earn over $300 million US in export of maize. You know, such a remarkable progress in a short time. And Tanzania having more ample land and surrounded with more countries, this is a great opportunity if we address the binding policy constraints such as trade restrictions. And I'm glad the current government has assured us that there'll be no trade restrictions. In terms of natural resources, it's true. Currently, Tanzania is losing about 400,000 hectares of forest land per year. And as you already heard during the presentation, most of the current increase in value of production is coming from expanding land. And that could have a really negative impact when it comes to sustainability of the production. But there are also statistics on post-harvest losses, which sometimes as high as 30%. So before you even think of increasing production, it's important to preserve what you have. And that can be done by improving post-harvest storage, but also improving agro-processing, which of course also could also have an impact in terms of trade. The link between trade and poverty reduction is very well documented, so that opens another opportunity, you know, for economic growth. On the inclusivity of growth, I would say that has been a challenge, and mainly because the sectors that has been driving growth are those that are not employing many people, and the agriculture naturally offers such an opportunity for inclusive growth. But it's also important to take note that for really to have an impact in poverty reduction, the growth also has to increase, the overall economic growth. The current growth rate of 5 up to 7% is not sufficient enough. We have experience from China. A growth of 10% probably would be the best option. When I look at the poverty reduction statistics, in the last 19 years, poverty has been declining at a rate of 0.5%. So if currently the poverty level is 26%, it means it's going to take you 50 years to see Tanzania without poverty, which means we need to step up, you know, overall economic growth in order to have an impact, in addition to improving investment in agriculture. Maybe I should stop there.
Thank you, Professor. We'll come to Holger, if you could respond to the 2 questions from Ifad and UN Women.
Yes, with great pleasure. Martina, thank you for your question. So how can we move ag away from the need for public support? We know each other for a moment. I don't think that's the question in the room. The question in the room is, if we support agriculture, what is the right way of doing it, and what are like desired outcomes of that support? An agriculture sector that's completely left to market forces without an incentivization for certain behaviors will not lead to desired outcomes in 3 key domains. Socioeconomic, and I come back to inclusive growth just in a second when I respond to your question. Environmental objectives. See, I mean, let me break environmental down just for a second, right? A little statal support to different water management, to more water saving and irrigation, for instance, will not emerge without incentives being provided. Without incentives, unfortunately, priceless water use is always a little wasteful. The market does not yet price that in, so it doesn't lead to that. Erosion control, which so much compromises soils in Tanzania, there is a reason, a very good justification to provide an incentive to embark on slightly different soil management practices. Or even reduction of waste on site. I mean, loss and waste in food. I mean, not only on a country scale, but almost on a global scale. I know this goes far beyond Tanzania, but if food loss and waste was a country, the total volume of loss, it would be the 3rd largest emitter on the globe in terms of like that impact that we have on resource abuse globally. So socioeconomic reasons to support the sector, environmental reasons, and then finally technological objectives. Just getting technologies sometimes into farming communities. Unfortunately, because it's not always a profit maximizing behavior, it sometimes takes an incentive to do this. You just quoted the China experience on poverty reduction, the Precision Poverty Reduction Program. It is very, very impressive when you stand on top of a high mountain in southern China, in the clouds, miserably cold, formerly deep poverty, and you have farmers that grow medicinal roots in a forest, not even close to any city, and they fulfill any internet order within 24 hours. Why are they able to do it? Because there was a public good reason to install mobile phone towers out there, although it doesn't deliver a good return on investment, and to keep open a postal office so that farmers can actually ship stuff out. These are all good reasons for public support. What we are calling for is just to think through the quality of public support and not how to get out of it. Yes.
How can we focus it to do some things which are very crucial?
Yes.
That strategy going ahead. Because now we know that the private, the moving is moving there. Where to focus it? But you don't have to answer that one.
No, and that Martima, is my pet discussion, and I know it's also your pet discussion, and this is why when I stood up there, I said, see, there are certain general principles that we have learned that work in supporting agriculture sector. Consistency, for instance. I mean, see, if all support would just stay true to pillars 1 and 3 of ASDP 2, then we would see sustained impact on commercialization while also building resilience. So it's basically now shifting the actual support to the sector to the already very appropriate strategic narrative that exists. On gender inclusive development and inclusive development, a hugely important topic for us as it is for you. Of course, my presentation cannot do justice to it. I'm very happy to have that discussion also off stage with you. I think on both sides we pay a lot of attention in the analytical work that underpins this work. See if you, and I'm happy to do that just in the break. If we go into this, what I refer to as EBA, Enabling the Business of Agriculture, eba.worldbank.org, you can actually break down the individual indicators that I just summarized. And many of them pose the gender question very, very explicitly. Take the one on trading food, which was very deficient among the bars on the Tanzania slide. You will find a sub-indicator that's basically, is there equal access to trading opportunity between the genders? And this matters because, see, if one question is, do we provide explicit support to one or the other gender? That's one question. But I think the much more fundamental question is, do we prevent a gender from having access to opportunity? Do we prevent it from having voice, having agency, having participation? And that pretty much we cover in EBA. I don't say EBA is perfect, But the attention is not only there on the funding side, but also on the regulatory side, which matters so much. When we come to funding, and perhaps just one element, see, think of that typical agriculture development project. That's not one that I advocate, but let's just think of a typical project, right? So that a financial allocation is being made, and then farming communities or processors in one or the other way benefit from financing opportunity. Usually there's a risk scoring that comes first. So an application is being furnished, and then you assess, is this an eligible beneficiary? I have always been a big proponent to score women and score youth with slightly higher success scores or lower risk scores so that they have preferential access. We usually see that these projects outperform and make up for otherwise imbalances in access. My final point, and I know I'm a little long, but this is really a passion topic for me. If we all agree to do a self-control test for the next couple of months, when we talk about agriculture, let's stop for a moment and try to think agri-food. This ecosystem is much larger than the farm. As we heard, it benefits a lot from all the downstream industries, right? And so what happens, particularly in response to the different demand of Africans for Africa-produced food, is that you have all these predominantly SMEs, processors, vendors, sellers. The whole commerce sector, I allege, is female-dominated for so many good reasons. The world has not yet done really good structured research on it, but this is a female-dominated system, and the more we think agri-food instead of agri-only, we capture much more the job multiplier effects, the income multiplier effects, and also the inclusiveness effects. This is, I thank you for that question. It's tremendously important.
Thank you. So just for a minute each are remaining. Mr. Magala, first, just your closing message in a minute.
I call this a myth. I grew up hearing this. 60 to 70% of Tanzanians are employed in the agriculture sector. You know, throughout the years, I've struggled understanding what it means to be employed into the agriculture sector. Is it that when you're a farmer and you're growing maize for food, are you employed in the agriculture sector? Maybe yes, but you just don't live on maize only. You need other stuff, you know, to be able to live. So you're either able to sell the maize to get money to buy the other stuff that you need to live. So where the employment part? Is it that growing that maize, or growing that maize and doing something else so you can get money, you know, to buy the other stuff? And you know, the point I'm trying to make here is that yes, agriculture can employ the 60–70% we've been talking about, but the structure needs to be different. You know, it needs to be, as P.S. Limo just put it, business. And as a business, a sustainable business needs to be profitable. If as farmers, over the years, we don't get to become profitable, we will eventually exit. You know, we will go and try and do something else that will make us survive. So if we were to consider agriculture as businesses, we also have got to understand that in that business, there will be some who will get rich, and that has not got to be a problem, because the more rich people in agriculture you get, the more these people are able to employ people. You know, like formally employ them, pay them, and the more lives you lift, you know, in terms of the quality of living. And, you know, we've had cases where we think, no, we can't support just a few because they'll become rich and the rest will become poor. I don't believe that. You know, the more people you support and they become successful, the more people are employed, the more people's lives are improved.
Thank you, Mr. Bagala. I'm going to stop you there if I may. You've had 2 minutes. So I'm going to go, Dr. Kilama, please, final remarks. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you, Miranda. For me, I think from today, the one point I think that I'm taking away is the reiteration that members have been raising is, in as much as we've concentrated a lot on the good news around the media, small-scale farmers, I think the point is to think about the entire value chain of whatever we will be concentrating on, so that at the end of the day, not only are we going to use a valuable innovation that is around us, but also to look at all the problems that we think are hindering the sector more inclusively. And in particular, issues that we rarely give attention to, we can give more attention to issues around when it comes to knowledge, but then soil health has become also very important. Because I believe once you do this, then the groups that we've been saying here are being left out or are really working in the sector, they can be included more. That is the women and also the youth. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kilama. Jafet, please close us down.
All right, thank you so much. I'm happy with the entire conversation, and it gives us a sense on where to go and also where we were. And we've seen quite stride growth in the sector with the meager resources which was in place. And this gives us processing, I believe for me, that create market in country. If we are to put our efforts together, pick a few of the value chains, like what SDP2 has mentioned, let's go. If we go for coffee, I know for someone who is involved in a seedling, it will take five years for me in a bank to receive the first repayment, so I need to give someone a grace period of 5 years. So I believe with a concerted effort and understanding among all of us as players, we have quite a huge opportunity. We as TADB and the government will come on longer term financing. We are looking for blended financing, others to come in on equity, some to come on venture capital, and for real, we can structure, design whatever transaction we want in whichever of the value chains. The opportunity is quite immense, and everybody has got a role to play. Thank you so much.
So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. I would like you to give, please, a hearty round of applause to our panelists, Dr. Blandina Kilama, Jafet Justin, Holger Gray, Mr. Franklin Bagala, and Professor Nyange. Can we have some more applause, please? We have got an absolute cross-section of knowledge from all of them. And I'll ask you to just remain seated, if you wouldn't mind, while we invite the country director, Bella Bird, up to officially close the 13th Tanzania Economic Update. Closing remarks from the director.
Well, thank you very much, Miranda. And can I just encourage another hearty round of applause for a brilliant panel, great participants, and of course, Miranda for her wonderful, patient, and focused facilitation. Let's give them a big clap. Thanks. So what I just, in drawing together that very rich discussion on such an important topic, it's a bit of a challenge. But I'm going to pick 3 key themes, and then I'm going to drill into the final theme with 7 points, I think, that takeaways, which is sort of bringing together what the audience highlighted together with, you know, what we're thinking in the World Bank. And certainly I got some new insights today. Firstly, just to go back to the part 1 of the economic update on the overall macroeconomic and growth situation, just a reminder that Tanzania is in a relatively stable position with a good, strong growth rate. But I think we mustn't forget some of the sustainability and the inclusiveness issues around growth. And these are very much identified in the presentation that Bill gave earlier and in the report. You know, the sustainability questions around the importance of any public investment giving a good return on growth, around the importance of fiscal policy being implemented in a way which stimulates growth in terms of delivering services and supporting the private sector. And thirdly, about the importance of continued and growing private sector investment in the economy in order to sustain growth and job creation. And then on inclusiveness, I think, you know, agriculture is the perfect inclusive growth topic. And I'm not going to give away any of the highlights of the poverty report on Tanzania, which we're going to be launching together with the National Bureau of Statistics on Friday in Dodoma. But I think there will be a fantastic continuation of the discussion we had today. What's happening with poverty reduction? What are the impacts of growth on poverty reduction in Tanzania, and are they good enough? And I'll leave that question with you to be answered on Friday, so you can all tune in then. But agriculture's got a critical role to play there. My second point is on agriculture, the agricultural transformation. And I think one of the things I really picked up from the discussion and hearing from Tanzanian colleagues in particular is this changing perception of agriculture, that it's not something, it's a dynamic sector where businesses want to invest. It's not just about subsistence agriculture anymore in Tanzania. It's recognizing there's a changing perception around the sector of this being a very exciting, dynamic sector for growth and for investment. And I think that's a big takeaway from this work that's demonstrating how agriculture is driving structural transformation in the economy. And changing mindsets on agriculture in Tanzania. And I think associated with that is the critical role that agriculture will play in job creation. And we, right at the beginning of the session today, we were talking about the 800,000 new entrants to the labour market every year, the young women and men who are looking for work, and 3/4 of them, well, 2/3 of them are going to find their jobs in agriculture and in agriculture-associated value chains, and 3/4 of the poor are going to find their livelihood there. So let's remember that, because those people are at the heart of everything that we do. Then moving on to the private sector role and the public sector role, and this is an issue which I've had many discussions on in Tanzania, and I don't think we've got crystal clarity yet, but and I think when you look across the world, and Holger Will, who's the global expert, can talk about this privately at length, is that in different countries, the public sector and the private sector take slightly different roles. But some of and in Tanzania, there's an evolution going on in terms of the public sector and the private sector roles in agriculture. And I think that's an ongoing dialogue which we're proud to be part of in the World Bank. But thinking about the sector and the public and private sector roles, let me just highlight some key issues, takeaways that came out of the discussion today. One is is how complementary investments undertaken by government are absolutely critical to enabling agriculture to be a driver of growth and poverty reduction. And here we heard about the importance of rural roads, about water resource management, and we're seeing the trade-offs between energy, between national parks, between agriculture. In one of our recent economic updates, we highlighted how important a user of water agriculture is, and how agriculture needs to be a very responsible user of water, given the trade-offs in the economy. I think we also mentioned was the importance of rural electrification, which is a big area of public investment here, and also of World Bank support. And we can see there's rapid progress being made on rural electrification, which will fuel the agribusiness sector in Tanzania. Also on the digital side, and I'll come back to that. So those complementary investments that are critical for enabling the expansion of agriculture. Second, on standards, and I think here we recognize that the work is required in Tanzania on raising the standards consistently to enable food safety and to also build confidence in Tanzanian products as they increasingly access export markets. And this is a key area that's been identified for public intervention. Third, on the business environment, we talk about the importance of opening up the business environment in the economy as a whole, but I think in agriculture in particular. And I think there it's about predictability, it's about streamlining regulations, implementing the blueprints, which is so critical to that. Fourthly, on technology, and it's been mentioned today at a few times, the importance of technology in driving the transformation that we've seen, but accelerating access to technology to drive the transformation of the future. And here we come back not just to digital, but how important digital connectivity is as a driver of that technological transformation. Linked to that is my fifth point, which is knowledge. And there, I loved the love story, in fact, about papayas and bananas, and the importance of knowledge transfer and in the sector. I mean, their digital connectivity is critical, but it's not the only thing. And I think there's still an unanswered question around extension in agriculture, which probably needs further discussion, and I'll put Holger at your disposal on that one for subsequent follow-up. Sixth, on finance, and great to have CRDB on the panel. How very good to see credit growth in the economy again, in the economy-wide, but also to hear that there is increased interest in the financial sector in investing in agriculture, and that's absolutely fundamental. Make sure that you're lending to women as well as men, and ensuring that their needs in particular are covered. And then finally, I think the issue of agriculture as a natural resource that needs protecting and sustaining. And it's in some of the follow-up analytical work that we've done, we'll see how land is degrading at a very rapid rate in Tanzania. And we've heard about the expansion of agriculture has been driven by bringing more land into cultivation, but is that happening sustainably? And the deforestation that's associated with that doesn't indicate a sustainable path. And when you look at population growth, or you look at how rapid population growth is going to in Tanzania is going to result in many more mouths to feed, the sustainable and renewable use of the natural resources for agriculture is absolutely fundamental. A critical point that was made is around the frequency of extreme weather events. Used to be once in 10 years, now once every 2.5 years. In East Africa, our eyes are being opened all over the world on this, and it brings us back to the importance of sustainable use of natural resources, all detailed in our recent country environmental assessment and in the agricultural work that our team's been working on. So they're my key points. I hope I haven't missed any of the gems that you offered. If so, please mention it afterwards. But thank you all again for a brilliant discussion. Let me just very finally talk about the analytical work that has been behind the work on agriculture. There's a lot more there. We've got 10 short policy notes which have been produced, and a full report on key areas. They all are available on our website, and we will be doing a series of media publications starting next week, and we'll be using social media, our Twitter account, to disseminate the key messages. And we'll also be doing a series of targeted seminars for stakeholders to look in detail at the findings of the work that we've done on agriculture, all with the objective of generating more public debate on how we together can support agriculture as an engine of growth and of inclusive growth and sustainable growth in Tanzania. So thank you all again. It's been a wonderful seminar. Thank you. Asanteni sana.